Hi everyone, my name is Dr. David McKinney from the UCD School of English Drama and Film. Welcome to this lecture on Samuel Beckett's relationship with Irish culture, identity and literature. Samuel Beckett is an artist whose work has a reputation for being avant-garde, difficult and esoteric. He's considered the last modernist and maybe the first postmodernist. His work then is regarded as quite difficult, and he himself is quite a mythical figure. But one way into Beckett's work, and there are many ways into Beckett's work, but one way is to remember that Beckett was, in fact, an Irish writer. He lived for a good portion of his young life in Ireland, and Ireland never really left him. As a result, Ireland is embedded in the texts, hidden. There are elements of Ireland which appear as forgotten, half-forgotten ideas. And in that case, it's possible to locate Beckett as an Irish writer. But while he lived for most of his adult life in France, it's worth noting that his Irish accent remained with him. Listen to this speech he gave accepting the Prix Italia.
It is a great honor for me to have been awarded the Italia Prize for my radio play Embers. I do not ordinarily write for radio, but I think that it is a medium which has not been fully exploited, and that there are great possibilities for writers in this form of expression.
Beckett then would seem to resist categorization with respect to any particular nationality. But it is possible to locate him as an Irish writer. He leaves Ireland, but in short, Ireland never really left him. Over the last 30 years, scholars have similarly noted the ways in which Beckett seems to address obliquely, in some sense, Ireland and Irish culture. He rarely says it very, very clearly, very out loud, what he's talking about. But little references and little embedded ideas suggest that Ireland is, in Beckett's work, which seems to dispense with place and the stability of identity, that Ireland is a half-forgotten memory that often seems to dog these characters. Beckett did, though, spend most of his life in France, particularly Paris. He left Ireland in the 1930s for good, saying that he preferred Paris in wartime to Ireland in peacetime. It seems that he really felt that he couldn't properly express himself there. The morality of Ireland and the fact that it was, as Joyce would have called it, a priest-ridden race, really seemed to make Beckett want to leave and never really come back, apart from several brief visits. One of his primary residences was in Ussy-sur-Marne, where he lived before he lived, if you like, full-time in Paris. He seemed to quite like the French countryside. But before that, he was quite active in the French resistance. This was to be a major turning point in Beckett's life. He saw really the potential of what people are capable of doing. He saw destruction and death on an unprecedented scale. He actually drove an ambulance for the French resistance and took many, many risks on his life. He would later dismiss this as Boy Scout stuff when he was given a medal for his bravery. But he spent much of his time on the run from the authorities when he was in France, constantly evading detection, constantly having to be moving and on the run throughout the French countryside. The threat to his life was pretty constant, and many of his friends were captured and killed. It was these stories which in some way formed the basis of books like What and Malloy, novels which feature a central wandering character on the run, constantly moving, looking for shelter. The difference is, though, that it's not terribly clear what these characters are running from. Beckett strips away much of the things that we can use to locate place and time. But critics have noticed the applicability of the French countryside, which Beckett was running throughout the war, to the very similar, in some respects, Irish countryside. This is especially significant since Beckett was quite fond of going on long walks in the Dublin Wicklow Mountains with his father. So it seems then that this action, the action of these works, seems to take place simultaneously in France and Ireland, but neither at the same time. One is submerged in the other. So today we'll be looking at the Irish Beckett. We're going to be looking at Beckett's identity as a person. We're going to be looking at his relationship with Irish literature. And we're also going to look at Waiting for Godot as an Irish text. Samuel Beckett then was born to Bill and May Beckett in 1906. He had one brother as well, Frank. He grew up in quite a comfortable surrounding. He lived in Cooldraina in Foxrock, which is obviously quite an exclusive area. So these were the surroundings in which he grew up. It seemed he felt more comfortable leaving these very comfortable circumstances to spend a much less comfortable time in the war. So he also grows up as someone who was Anglo-Irish. Declan Khyber then defines Anglo-Irish as somebody who was descended from the plantations, but then becomes culturally more Irish, because of course people do come to Ireland and then live there for generations while never fully integrating with the culture because they're sort of on the outside. Now Beckett's case is a little bit different because the Becketts were actually descended from the Huguenots. But Declan Khyber says that the Anglo-Irish live on the hyphen between Anglo and Irish. It means they're too English to be Irish and too Irish to be English. And as a result, they're kind of outsider figures, really. And we see quite a bit of this in Beckett's work, the outsider figure who doesn't fully understand what's going on, but yet is keenly astute with, or curious rather, with humanity. In terms of identity then, Beckett has quite a bit of similarity between some of Ireland's finest writers. Oscar Wilde, also Anglo-Irish, has quite a few characters in his novels who long for something, who want to belong to something. W.B. Yeats was somebody who wanted to inscribe himself as being at the core of Irish art and Irish poetry. And John Millington Synge, of course, one of Beckett's main influences, one of the few people Beckett would actually name explicitly as an influence much later in his life, was also of Anglo-Irish origin. Elizabeth Bowen is a particularly apt comparison to make with Beckett. Elizabeth Bowen lived her life in Cork, in Danielstown, which was quite far away from anyone else. It was quite secluded, and as a result, she was always on the outside. There's a passage, for example, in The Last September, when the characters see one of the soldiers fighting in the Irish War of Independence, and they're genuinely amazed. It's almost as if they've never seen an Irish Catholic before. So Anglo-Irish artists seem to have been on the outside to begin with, generally. And this makes them even more astute at critiquing Irish society. In Cooldraina, then, Beckett was also quite secluded, quite protected. And one of the major events in his early life was in 1916, when he would have been 10. And his father brought Sam and his brother Frank up to the Dublin Mountains to watch what was going on in the Rising. Sam was watching Dublin being destroyed underneath, and he burst into tears. Bill and May Beckett then felt that it would be safer for the boys to go to school somewhere else, to leave Dublin. They had been getting the tram into Harcourt Street every day to go to school, but it seemed no longer safe to do so. So as a result, they decided to pack Sam off to Portora School for Boys in Enniskillen. After graduating from Portora, he went to Trinity College where he studied French and Italian. He excelled and he was given a double first with a gold medal. He also was an extremely accomplished cricket player there at the time. He was then appointed exchange lecturer in Paris, and he was sent over there where he seemed to prefer to Ireland. He came back though, and he felt that he just couldn't teach. He felt he could not teach things about which he knew nothing, and he resigned his lectureship. It was shortly after that, really, that Beckett felt that he had to leave Ireland, and it was France which seemed to offer him the best opportunity. He preferred the culture, he preferred the people, and he was also very much interested in French literature, which didn't have the same moral constraints as Irish culture. So in one sense, as an outsider, he seems to repudiate Ireland. He seems to want to move away from it, in much the same way as James Joyce did. James Joyce left Ireland and rarely, if ever, came back. But yet, 99% of his work is set in Dublin. Beckett is a little bit different because he leaves Ireland with much the same disdain for Irish culture. And while his work is not explicitly set there, it's still embedded there. There is an unavoidable Irish quality to Beckett's work, even though he's an outsider and even though he left Ireland for good. So in the next section, we're going to move on to Beckett's relationship with Irish literature.